Have you ever laid next to someone you love, and yet felt 1,000 miles apart? You share the same bed, the same house, the same routines, but somehow, you no longer share the same heart. There are no fights. No shouting, just silence, and in that silence, a silent cry echoes. A longing, unspoken, unheard. This isn't just their story, it's the story of millions, of lovers who grew distant, of friends who drifted, of parents and children who don't talk anymore, and most painfully, it's often the story of those who still love each other. We live in a world that teaches us how to fall in love, but never how to stay in love, how to start a relationship, but never how to nurture one. We are taught to chase butterflies, but never to tend the garden they live in. That's where Buddhism enters, not as a religion to preach at you, but as a lens. A mirror. A path, a way of seeing love, not as a fleeting emotion, but as a spiritual training ground, a practice, a presence, because in Buddhism, love is not something you have. It's something you do, something you are, and most importantly, something you understand. This journey we're about to begin isn't just about building lasting relationships, it's about transforming them. It's not about keeping people in your life by force, but holding space for them with compassion. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore what it means to truly love. Not through control or passion, but through wisdom and presence. We'll explore why impermanence is not your enemy, but your greatest teacher, why the ego destroys what the heart wants to protect, and how deep listening can sometimes save a love that words could not. So if your heart has ever ached in silence, if you've ever asked, why does love slip away even when it's still here? You're not alone, and you're not broken, you've simply been walking without a map, but the Buddha left us one, and it starts here. Let me take you back to a moment, a warm afternoon, golden light spilling through a kitchen window, two people sit across from each other, once lovers, now strangers. The tea between them has gone cold, not from time, but from silence. He asks, when did we become like this? She looks away and whispers, I don't know. I didn't notice the change. That's the thing about change, it doesn't knock on your door, it slips in quietly. Like breath, like dusk, in Buddhism, there's a word for this truth, Anicca, impermanence. Everything is changing, everything, the joy, the sorrow, the closeness, the distance, even you, even them, and yet, we suffer not because things change, but because we expect them not to. We expect love to feel like it did on the first day, we expect people to stay the same, we expect our partners to never grow tired, never grow apart, never grow different. But here's the truth the Buddha taught, trying to preserve a moment forever is like trying to hold sunlight in your hands. When we don't understand impermanence, we become fearful, we grip tighter, we demand more, we try to freeze people into versions of themselves that no longer exist. But when we see clearly, when we accept impermanence, we stop clinging, and start appreciating. Suddenly, your partner's smile becomes precious, not because it will last, but because it won't. Your child's laughter becomes a blessing, not because it's yours, but because it's fleeting. Impermanence doesn't mean love fades, it means love evolves. If we don't resist it, if we learn to dance with it, then even the fading can be beautiful. Like autumn leaves that fall, not in despair, but in grace. The secret to a lasting relationship isn't about holding on forever, it's about holding each moment fully, before it passes. And maybe, just maybe, if we love with awareness that everything changes, we'll finally stop asking, why don't they love me like before? And start asking, how can I love them better now? We all want to be loved, but have you ever asked, who exactly is it that wants to be loved? The me that gets jealous, the me that wants to be right, the me that says, you should know what I need, without me having to say it. That voice in our head, that voice that says, they don't see me. They don't appreciate me. They hurt me. That voice isn't love, that's the ego. In Buddhist teachings, this illusion is called Anatta, non-self. It doesn't mean you don't exist. It means the rigid, fixed version of you, the one constantly protecting itself, defending itself, feeding on pride and fear. That self isn't real, and when two selves collide in a relationship, each one trying to win, to be heard more, to be right more, what happens? Love becomes a battlefield, connection becomes negotiation, and slowly, softness dies. I once heard a story about a couple who fought over the most ordinary things, the dishes, the schedule, who said what and how it was said. They weren't bad people, they loved each other, but their egos were louder than their love, until one day, the wife said, "I realized I was more committed to winning than to understanding." She started practicing something radical, letting her ego die a little, so the relationship could live. Because ego always wants to be loved, but the heart simply wants to love. When you drop the ego, you no longer ask, "Why aren't they giving me more?" You begin to ask, "How can I give more and suffer less?" And suddenly, conflicts soften, walls fall, you stop being two people trapped in a tug of war, and start becoming two people dancing with difference. The Buddha didn't ask us to erase who we are, he asked us to stop clinging to a version of ourselves that causes pain. The ego says, "They should change for me." Wisdom says, "Maybe love is how I transform." What if love wasn't about being special to someone, but about seeing the sacredness in everyone? What if love wasn't a contract, but a gift? What if the highest form of love was not romantic, but boundless? The Buddha gave this love a name, Metta, loving kindness, a love that wants others to be happy, without needing anything in return, no strings, no scorecards, just the quiet wish, may you be well. May you be peaceful. May you be free. At first glance, it sounds too simple, too soft, too passive. But here's the truth, Metta is not weakness, it's power in its purest form, because Metta doesn't control, it doesn't cling, it doesn't say, "Be mine." It says, "Be free." And that kind of love changes everything. Imagine being in a relationship, where you don't just want someone to make you happy, you want them to be truly free and fulfilled, even if that journey takes them away from you. That's not detachment, that's the deepest intimacy. There's a story told in Buddhist tradition, about a monk who practiced metta every day, not just for the people he liked, but even for the people who annoyed him, ignored him, even hated him. When asked why, he said simply, "Because I refuse to let their anger change my love." What would happen if we loved like that, if we could look at our partner, our parent, our friend, not as someone who owes us anything, but as a living being doing their best to find peace, just like us? And in that moment, we become less focused on what we're getting, and more alive in what we're giving. This doesn't mean letting yourself be mistreated. Loving kindness includes yourself too. It means you don't have to harden just because the world is harsh. You can set boundaries without closing your heart. You can say no with metta. You can walk away with metta. Because metta isn't about staying in a relationship, it's about staying in love. Even when things change, even when people go, even when the chapter ends. So next time you feel forgotten, hurt, unseen, ask yourself, can I respond with love that liberates, not love that binds? Because in that space, love ceases to be a transaction, and becomes a transformation. Sometimes, what breaks a relationship, is not betrayal, but the slow erosion, of not feeling heard. It begins with silence, then misunderstanding, then assumption, until one day, we're talking, but no longer connecting. The Buddha taught that love is not just in the heart, it must also live on the tongue, and in the ear. Two of the Eightfold Path's most powerful limbs, right speech and right mindfulness, are about how we communicate. Because if love is the seed, then communication is the soil. Without care, even the purest love will wither. So what does deep listening mean? It means you stop listening, just to reply, just to defend, just to fix. You listen to understand. To make space, to hold their pain without rushing to silence it. You listen with your heart, not just your ears. Thich Nhat Hanh once said, the most precious gift we can offer another is our presence. Not advice, not correction, just presence. And then there's right speech, not just about avoiding lies or gossip, but speaking in ways that are true, kind, necessary, and timely. Imagine if we filtered every word through those 4 gates. Before you say it, ask yourself, is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? Is this the right time? Sometimes, silence is the most loving response, and sometimes, truth spoken without kindness, is just another form of violence. Let me tell you a story. A man came to a Zen master and said, "My wife doesn't understand me, she never listens." The master said, "Do you truly listen to her?" He replied, "Yes, of course I do, when she's wrong." The master smiled gently, "Then you're not listening, you're waiting to correct." Communication, in mindfulness, isn't about winning conversations, it's about weaving connection. It's not about speaking more loudly, it's about hearing more deeply. So next time your partner says something hard, don't rush to fix it, don't rush to justify, just breathe, be still, let your heart say, "I'm here. I hear you. I'm not leaving just because this is uncomfortable." That is metta in action, and when you speak, speak not from pride, but from peace, not to control, but to connect, because every word is a seed, and every silence, a mirror. What if love wasn't just an experience of the heart? What if it was also the greatest teacher of your life? What if your relationship, in its beauty and its challenges, was the path that led you to your highest self? Many people see their relationships as either a source of happiness or a source of pain. We cling to the joy and push away the suffering. We expect love to always feel easy. But in Buddhism, we understand that love is not a destination, it's a journey, a spiritual path. When you truly love someone, you are not just bound by feelings of affection, you are bound by the awakening that comes when two souls come together and reflect each other's deepest fears, desires, flaws, and potential. Think about it, every time you are triggered by a partner, every time you argue or feel misunderstood, it's an invitation to look deeper within yourself, an invitation to confront the parts of you that you hide, an invitation to practice patience, compassion, and mindfulness, not only with them, but with yourself. The Buddha taught that relationships are mirrors. They show us the things we don't want to see, the things we'd rather ignore, the places in our hearts that need healing, and yet, it's in those very moments of discomfort that our deepest spiritual growth occurs, because we are being asked to let go of the ego, to soften our judgments, and to open our hearts more fully. One day, I heard a story about a couple who had been together for many years. They'd been through all the ups and downs, the joyful times, the heartbreaking times, but something shifted in them. They began to see their relationship as a practice, not just a partnership, a practice of mindfulness, a practice of compassion. They would sit together in silence every morning, just breathing together, no words, no expectations, simply allowing their hearts to be present to each other. They found that when they began to view their relationship as a spiritual path, they no longer expected perfection from each other. Instead, they saw each other's imperfections as opportunities to practice love, because in the end, the deepest love isn't about being perfect, it's about being present, it's about showing up for each other, even when it's hard, it's about holding space for your partner's struggles, and allowing them to hold space for yours, when you walk the path of love. As a spiritual journey, you stop seeing each other as just human beings, you start seeing each other as bodhisattvas, as spiritual beings helping each other reach enlightenment. Your relationship becomes a sacred space, a place where you can grow, heal, and transform together. You might ask, but what if the path becomes too hard? What if the pain seems unbearable? What if the weight of love feels like too much to carry? Remember, even the hardest path is made of small steps, and the Buddha didn't promise us a life free of pain, but he did promise us the way through it, and sometimes, love is the way through. We've come to the final chapter of this journey, and yet, this is not the end. This is the moment when everything changes, when we finally see love, not as a destination to reach, but as a way of being. So many people ask, how do I know if this relationship is right? How do I know if I should stay, or if I should go? And the answer is simpler than you think. True love is not about staying in the perfect relationship, it's about staying present in whatever relationship you choose. It's about choosing to see, not just with your eyes, but with your heart, to choose to see the whole person, the good, the bad, the light, the dark, to choose to see the human being behind the story you've created. It's easy to love when everything is perfect, it's harder, though, when things aren't going right, when the argument drags on, when the silence feels heavy, when the hurt feels too deep. But in those moments, you have a choice. You can either leave, or you can stay, and choose to see with a new lens. The Buddha taught us that attachment is the root of suffering. When we cling to an idea of what someone should be, when we try to mold them into a version of ourselves, that's when love starts to crumble, because we stop seeing them, we stop accepting them as they are. True love doesn't demand perfection, it demands presence. It asks you to stay. Even when you'd rather walk away, to choose to see your partner's imperfections with compassion, to see their struggles as your own, and to choose to grow with them, not as one fixed entity, but as two souls evolving together. There's a beautiful Zen story that illustrates this perfectly. A young monk went to his master, and asked, "Master, what should I do when I feel the urge to leave a relationship?" The master replied, "You should stay, and let your love deepen. You should look closer, and see beyond your anger, your disappointment. You should look at your partner as though for the first time, as though you are meeting them in the present moment." This, my friend, is the deepest form of love, not the kind that runs when things get tough, but the kind that says, "I choose to see you, not as I wish you were, but as you truly are, and I will stay with you through that truth." So when you face those moments of doubt, those moments of pain, ask yourself, am I choosing to stay? And if you are, ask yourself, am I choosing to see? Because that is love, choosing to stay. Choosing to see, and choosing to love without conditions. This is the new way of loving, a love that is free from attachment, a love that doesn't cling, but supports, a love that doesn't demand, but gives. True love doesn't ask for perfection, it simply asks for presence. As we end this chapter, remember this: love is not about possession, it's about freedom. Love is not about staying in a comfortable place, it's about growing, expanding, and evolving together. And sometimes, love is about walking away, so both of you can walk into your own freedom. So, no matter where you are in your journey of love, know that the path will be full of joy, pain, growth, and understanding. And if you walk it with mindfulness, compassion, and the willingness to truly see each other, you will have found a love that is lasting, a love that is real, a love that is free. Thank you for walking this path with me. May you find love, not as an expectation, but as an experience of liberation. May you always choose to stay, and always choose to see.